Hi, shalom friends. I'd like to share with you a story that happened with our Rabbi, Rabbi Schneerson, a story that took place over 70 years ago, but its lesson, inspiration, and challenge is something that we have to adapt even today. In the early 1940s, there was a young religious man who was connected to the dynasty of Ger, which is a big Hasidic group. His name was Weinberg. I'll call him Rabbi Weinberg today. And this Rabbi Weinberg was he was in the textile business. He was actually very, very unusually successful, rich actually according to the standards of those times. And being that he worked with textiles, he needed a lot of wool and cotton and so on. And he used to travel to New Zealand, and he had over there some type of contacts that were taking from the sheep and sending the wool and so on to Israel. He had a sister living in New York City, Brooklyn. So on one of his trips, he visits his sister who's living in an apartment building. As he's waiting for the elevator to take him to his sister, a young man in his 40s comes, and in those days, a person with a beard, there were religious Jews, but beards were not very popular, and he sees this obviously religious man, a rabbi. So Weinberg says to him, Shalom Aleichem, and the other person responds, Aleichem Shalom, upon you is peace. They both walk into the elevator, and they start a very short conversation. So this bearded man says to Weinberg, what brings you here? Obviously you're a stranger. He says, well, I have a sister that lives on the third floor, and I'm visiting her from my visit from New Zealand. And this man looks at Weinberg and says, interesting, New Zealand. Is there a mikva, a ritual bath? Is there a mikva in New Zealand? And this young businessman says, look, I don't know. I go for business. I have no idea how many Jews are there, and certainly if they're interested in mikva. By the time he finishes the conversation, the door opens. Weinberg goes out, and his sister, Weinberg's sister, is waiting. And this man, the perfect gentleman, sees her and he lifts his hat in the 1940s, Yadaf hat, and they went further. When Weinberg goes out, the sister says, do you know who that young man was? No. Says, that's the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson's son-in-law. He's visiting someone in this building, and they say he's a genius of Torah. You're very fortunate to have met him. Okay. Let's fast forward. This Weinberg, this rich man who's connected to the dynasty of Ger, becomes much more, I don't know if the word is religious, but more back to his roots. He grows his beard. He starts wearing the long black coat, and his business is flourishing. So he still makes his visits, not as often, but he still makes visits to New Zealand. By this time, he has not only grandchildren, but great-grandchildren. And in one of his visits to New York, he heard so much about Rabbi Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he heard that the Lubavitcher Rebbe every Sunday would actually give out $1 and bestow a blessing. And it was a great privilege to even spend seconds in the presence of this holy man who was a leader of worldwide Jewry. So he decides to go to 770 Brooklyn, and he sees a line very long. He waited in a line almost 3 hours, but he knew that to see the Rebbe and to get something from him is something that it's worthwhile waiting. So he stands in front of the Rebbe. He's fully bearded, wearing his, not costume, his garment of a different Hasidic dynasty. And the Rebbe gives him $1, gives him a blessing, Baracha v'hatzlacha, blessing and success, and he goes, and he's fortunate. He got something from a holy man. Of course, he's going to treasure that as a good omen. And as he's leaving, suddenly the secretary, Rabbi Ahron, calls him back. He calls him back, and he looks at the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, so tell me, is there a mikvah in New Zealand? And sheepishly, he looks at the Rebbe, he shrugs, I don't know. And as he's walking, he cannot believe what just occurred. He had met this Rebbe over 40 years earlier. He did not have a beard at that time. He's 40 years later, he's already a grandfather, and I believe he had one great-grandchild, and the Rebbe still remembered him? I mean, this is not a person who has a great memory. This is unusual, supernatural. When he goes back to Israel, he tells his Rebbe of the Hasidic dynasty that he followed was the 7th Rebbe of Ger. They call him the Pnei Menachem. And knowing that the Pnei Menachem, his Rebbe, respected greatly the Lubavitcher Rebbe, though it's a different Hasidic sect, he says, Rebbe, I want to tell you a story that happened. And he gives over the story. And he says, Rebbe, isn't it remarkable? Maybe a minute or a little bit more than a minute encounter I had with the Lubavitcher Rebbe over 40 years ago, he recognized me and remembered the conversation. His Rebbe looks at him and says, that's impressive to you? His memory? Let me explain to you something. When the Rebbe saw you, he didn't just look at your face. He saw your personality, and deeper than that, he saw your neshama. That doesn't change over 40 years. So when you stood before him, he recognized you right away, because your soul remained the same, and essentially your personality remained the same. But what's truly remarkable is not that he recognized you. What's truly remarkable is what he asked you. Is there a mikveh in New Zealand? That means for 40 years, the Rebbe was thinking about Jews in New Zealand, wondering if they have the spiritual necessities that they need. That is something. It's a beautiful story that happened, and it's challenging to us. No, obviously, we will not recognize someone over 40 years, especially when that person has changed his looks and his garments. But what's challenging is that a holy man who lives in Brooklyn, who physically never went to New Zealand, for 40 years is thinking, do my brothers and sisters living in the opposite end of this universe, do they have what they need to serve Hashem? That, my friends, is inspiring and challenging, because we have to ask, what about our neighbor? Does he have what he needs? Does she have what she needs? We see them every day, but we know that they don't have a mezuzah. Maybe they don't know what a mezuzah is. Maybe they don't know where to get a mezuzah. Maybe they're frightened of a mezuzah. Why not at least introduce it? Ask them. Do they have what they need? If a holy man, a scholar, a saint, and someone who was beyond busy could worry and agonize and think about Jews he never met, and yet he knows they're there, what about us? So how did the Rebbe know that if there would have been a mikveh, that whatever few Jews living in New Zealand would use it? So I want to share with you another story. This, I don't have an eyewitness, but this is a story that I read about a great rabbi who lived in the golden age of Spain. This takes us back some 600 years or so ago, where Jews were living not only comfortably, not only were they respected, but many of the nobility had Jewish advisors. So the story that I read goes as follows, that there was one ruler, I don't know if he was a ruler like a caliph, But there was one ruler who had a Jewish advisor, a great rabbi, and they were friends. He advised the king, but he also would bring to the table a spiritual perspective which this king did not have. Many times they spoke about Jewish people and their allegiance to the Torah, and the king or the ruler would say to this rabbi, Jews are very different because of the way they practice and the way they observe their religion. And the rabbi would say, that's true, but it's much deeper. They are different because of their DNA. And this is something that, how do you prove that? So it was often a topic of discussion where the rabbi would insist Jews are different than non-Jews, not only because they put on tefillin or keep kosher, but because by nature they are different. And the king would say they're different because of their observance. Until finally, one time, the king had a brilliant idea. He said to the rabbi, if you truly believe that Jews are different, not because of their observance of the law, but because of their birth, you should be able to recognize a Jew from a non-Jew. The rabbi shrugged. Okay, I'm willing to take that. He said, give me some time. I want to devise a test. What happened was the king did some research and found out that there was a Jewish boy that was adopted by a non-Jewish family when the kid was maybe 9 or 10 months old. And essentially, this Jewish boy was being raised as a non-Jew. I'm not sure if it was Islam or Christian, but he was raised as a non-Jew. So for all practical purposes, this 15-year-old boy was a Spaniard and not any different than any other of the Spaniards. So the king, after finding this, invited him or commanded him to come to the palace, as well as an ordinary Spaniard who did not have a Jewish origin, to the palace. And he says to the rabbi, I have 2 boys, both of the same age, similar background. One is Jewish, who doesn't know, and the other one is not Jewish. If you claim that the Jew is different by DNA, you should be able to recognize them. The rabbi thought for a moment. He said, fine. Can I ask the palace kitchen to provide some refreshments? He says, yeah, what do you want? He said, I'd like some clusters of grapes. So immediately they bring up to the thing 3-4 clusters of grapes. What the rabbi did was he took one of the clusters and he took off the individual grape and made it into some type of a circle. So basically you had a cluster in the middle and you had grapes around. And he said, let's serve it to these 2 young boys, young men. And the rabbi observes both of them eating and then says to the king, the one on the left is Jewish. The 2 boys were dismissed, and the king looked at the rabbi and said, you're right. How did you know? You didn't ask them any questions. You did not devise anything. All you saw them was eating grapes. How did you know? He said, I noticed that the one on the right was took from the grapes that were on the plate. The one on the left took from the cluster. And a Jew by nature will look for his origin. And because he's looking for his origin, everything that he touches, he's always looking to see where it's connected to, where it comes from. Now, you might shrug your shoulders. I found it fascinating, but the concept is true. Concept is true. Jews are always looking from where do we come from? Or why are we attracted to certain things? Or perhaps, why do we have this love-hate relationship with something called Hashem? It's uncanny how true that is. We are yearning for where we come from. We know we come from somewhere. We're always looking for that somewhere. So friends, There are Jews in New Zealand. I could tell you there's Chabad there, so there is also a mikveh in New Zealand. And I could also tell you with a certainty, not only based on myself, my family, my experience, but because it's a truth. Every one of us, man, woman, or child, observant, learned, ignorant, unobservant, we're all yearning, we're all looking, we're all searching for our source. And you don't have to look that far. We're the children of Abraham and Sarah. We're the people that God spoke to on Mount Sinai. If we know where we come from, let's go home and feel comfortable once again. Shalom.